She called me just a colleague at the charity gala, so I introduced her as my ex-girlfriend to her father's business associates. I never expected her mother's smile to reveal everything I needed to know about our 4-year relationship. The Children's Hospital Foundation Gala was one of those black tie affairs where Elena's father served on the board of directors, and I'd been looking forward to finally meeting his business circle as her serious boyfriend after years of being kept in the shadows. I wore my best navy suit, the one I'd had tailored specifically for events like this, brought a substantial donation check from my furniture restoration business, and genuinely believed this would be the night our relationship finally stepped into the public light where it belonged. The grand ballroom at the Meridian Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, filled with the kind of understated wealth that whispered rather than shouted, exactly the environment where Elena always seemed most comfortable and confident. I'd spent the drive over rehearsing conversations, imagining how I'd discuss my custom work with potential clients, how proud I'd feel standing beside Elena as her partner, not realizing I was about to be publicly demoted instead. When we approached the registration table, I heard her clear her throat in that particular way that usually preceded something I wouldn't like, the same sound she made before canceling our weekend plans or suggesting we take separate cars to events. "This is Marcus, just a colleague from the design industry," she said smoothly to the hostess, a silver-haired family friend who'd specifically mentioned seeing the lovely couple in the program notes that Elena had tried unsuccessfully to have edited just 2 weeks prior. The words hit me like ice water down my spine. For years of private intimacy, shared holidays, and quiet Sunday mornings reduced to professional acquaintance in a single, calculated sentence delivered with the same tone she'd used to order coffee. I stood there for exactly 3 seconds, processing the casual cruelty of being demoted to colleague status in front of people who clearly mattered to her, people she'd never bothered introducing me to despite countless opportunities, then decided I was absolutely done playing along with whatever elaborate game this had become. "Actually, I'm Elena's ex-boyfriend," I said clearly to the group of major donors and board members who'd gathered around us, my voice carrying just enough to reach the nearby tables where more of her father's associates were pretending not to listen. "We broke up about 30 seconds ago when she introduced me as just a colleague after 4 years together." The ballroom didn't exactly fall silent, but our immediate vicinity certainly did, champagne glasses frozen halfway to lips as Elena's family absorbed what they were witnessing. Their carefully orchestrated social evenings suddenly transformed into an uncomfortable family drama. Her father looked genuinely confused and hurt, glancing between us like he was trying to solve a puzzle he'd been given the wrong pieces for, while her younger brother stopped mid-conversation with obvious shock and what might have been a hint of admiration. But it was her mother's reaction that struck me most powerfully and would haunt me for weeks afterward. Instead of embarrassment or anger or the social horror I'd expected, she smiled, a slow, knowing expression that seemed almost relieved, as if something she'd been waiting for had finally happened exactly as she'd predicted. I watched her lean over to whisper something urgent to Elena's aunt, who immediately glanced at me with what looked surprisingly like sympathy rather than judgment, as if they both understood something about this situation that I was only beginning to grasp. Elena's face cycled rapidly through mortification, fury, and something that might have been genuine panic as she realized I'd just publicly ended what she'd apparently never been willing to publicly claim, her carefully constructed social facade crumbling in real time. The rest of the evening crawled by with excruciating politeness, forced smiles, and conversations that carefully avoided acknowledging the elephant that had just trumpeted through their elegant charity event, but I kept catching Elena's mother watching me with that peculiar, almost maternal smile, like she was seeing something the rest of us had completely missed and finding it somehow satisfying. I met Elena 4 years earlier at a professional networking mixer for young entrepreneurs in the renovated warehouse district, where she was launching her sustainable fashion consultancy and I was establishing my custom furniture restoration business after leaving a soul-crushing corporate job that had me designing cubicles instead of creating something meaningful. She'd approached my display table where I was showing before and after photos of antique pieces I'd brought back to life, genuinely impressed by a Victorian armoire I'd rescued from an estate sale and transformed into something that belonged in Architectural Digest rather than a garage sale dumpster. "This is incredible craftsmanship," she'd said, running her fingers along the hand-carved details I'd painstakingly restored over 6 weeks of evenings and weekends, and I remember thinking this was someone who understood the difference between mass-produced furniture and genuine artistry, someone who appreciated the patience and skill required to breathe life back into forgotten pieces. We talked for 2 hours that night about sustainable business practices, the satisfaction of creating something lasting with your own hands, and our shared belief that quality craftsmanship was becoming a lost art in our increasingly disposable culture where everything was designed to break and be replaced within a few years. She told me about her vision for helping fashion brands transition to sustainable materials and ethical manufacturing, while I explained my mission to rescue furniture that would otherwise end up in landfills, and we both felt like we'd found someone who understood that work could be about more than just making money. For the first year and a half, she seemed genuinely proud to introduce me to her colleagues and friends, calling me her boyfriend without hesitation and posting photos of us at industry events on her constantly updated Instagram and LinkedIn accounts that showcased her networking successes and professional achievements. But somewhere around month 18, the introductions began changing in subtle ways that I initially dismissed as nervousness or social awkwardness rather than the deliberate pattern of systematic erasure I now recognize they clearly were from the very beginning. She started introducing me as my business contact at industry events, then graduated to someone I'm seeing casually when talking to friends, and eventually began avoiding couple photos on social media despite posting multiple times daily about every other aspect of her carefully curated life, from her morning smoothies to her weekend yoga classes. I rationalized each incident individually like the naive optimist I was, telling myself she was protecting our privacy or maintaining professional boundaries, never stepping back to see the bigger picture of systematic erasure that was happening right in front of my eyes, never questioning why someone who loved me would be so careful to hide that love from the world. The red flags I should have recognized included her increasingly firm insistence on taking separate Uber rides to events even when we were going to the exact same place at the exact same time, her stubborn refusal to combine our friend groups despite multiple natural opportunities for introductions that would have enriched both our social circles, and the way she'd mysteriously change my contact name in her phone from Marcus Redheart to just Marcus W. whenever her family visited or called or she attended family functions where my existence might come up in conversation. I remember a particularly painful moment 6 months before the charity gala when her younger sister Sophia got engaged to her longtime boyfriend during a romantic weekend getaway, and during the celebratory family video call that followed, Sophia asked directly if Elena and I would be next to walk down the aisle, only for Elena to laugh nervously and say, "Oh, we're taking things really slow, you know how it is," while I sat right beside her on the couch listening to myself being reduced to a casual dating experiment after 3.5 years of what I'd believed was building toward a serious future together. The host of the charity gala, Mrs. Richardson, was a longtime family friend who'd known Elena since she was a little girl attending cotillion classes and debutante balls, and she'd specifically mentioned seeing the lovely couple in the printed program notes after Elena had told her weeks earlier that we were attending together as a serious, committed pair ready to be seen publicly by her father's business associates and social circle. Elena had called Mrs. Richardson 3 separate times in the days leading up to the event, trying desperately to get that innocent reference edited out of the program, claiming it was presumptuous and premature to assume we were a couple despite our 4 years together. But the programs had already been printed and distributed to the 800 distinguished guests expected to attend the Foundation's most important fundraising event of the year. I should have realized then that someone truly committed to our relationship wouldn't have been mortified by public acknowledgement of our partnership, wouldn't have spent hours trying to erase evidence of our connection before it could reach her family's social circle. But I was still operating under the naive assumption that her hesitation came from shyness or social anxiety rather than genuine shame about being associated with me, still desperately believing that her love for me was real even if her willingness to claim me publicly remained frustratingly and mysteriously absent from every situation that actually mattered to her. After the public declaration that ended our relationship, Elena's father approached me with the careful politeness of a man trying to salvage a social disaster, requesting a private conversation on the hotel's expansive marble terrace overlooking the city lights that sparkled like the jewelry adorning the wealthy guests inside. "Marcus, I have to admit I'm genuinely confused by what just happened in there," he said, loosening his black bow tie in the cool evening air while the sounds of the continuing gala drifted through the French doors behind us. "I've always believed you two were seriously dating, planning a future together. Elena speaks about you constantly at our family dinners, shows us photos of furniture pieces you've restored for your clients, even mentioned just last month that you were looking at houses together." The revelation hit me like a physical blow to my chest. She'd been performing our relationship for her family while systematically erasing it from her public life, creating two completely different versions of our reality depending on her audience and what served her purposes in each situation. "She told you we were looking at houses?" I asked, my voice catching slightly as I remembered how she'd refused to even discuss moving in together after 4 years, claiming she needed her independence and wasn't ready for that level of commitment or shared responsibility. "Last month she showed us online listings, said you'd found a perfect place in the suburbs with a detached workshop space for expanding your restoration business," her father continued, his genuine confusion deepening as he realized something fundamental wasn't adding up in the story he'd been told by his daughter for months. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind us, I watched Elena dance with Dr. Andrew Harrison, the prominent cardiac surgeon's son her mother had introduced her to earlier, with obvious strategic intent written all over her satisfied expression, noticing how completely differently Elena moved with this virtual stranger, laughing louder than I'd heard in months, touching his arm frequently with practiced flirtation, clearly performing the role of available, interested woman for an audience that included several influential board members and their carefully watching wives. The contrast was stark and painful to witness. With me, she'd always been more reserved in public settings, careful not to appear too attached or committed, but with this man she'd met 3 hours ago, she was practically glowing under the ballroom's crystal chandeliers, transformed into the vivacious, engaging woman I'd only been allowed to see during our most private moments when no one else was watching. She's always struggled with what I call performance anxiety around the family legacy and expectations, her father admitted quietly, his voice heavy with years of watching his eldest daughter battle social pressures he'd never fully understood or known how to address. "Your mother puts tremendous pressure on all of us to maintain certain standards, certain appearances, certain types of relationships that reflect well on the family name. I'm genuinely sorry if that's affected how Elena feels she can present your relationship publicly." His apology felt sincere and heartfelt, but it couldn't erase 4 years of being hidden like a shameful secret, of being systematically introduced as temporary when I'd believed with complete certainty that we were building something permanent and meaningful together. Elena's younger brother David appeared at the mahogany bar beside me as I nursed an expensive whiskey and tried to process everything I'd learned in the past hour, his designer tuxedo slightly rumpled from dancing and his speech carrying the careful precision of someone managing their alcohol intake at an important family event. "Look, man, I probably shouldn't tell you this because Elena would kill me," he said, glancing around nervously to make sure we weren't being overheard by the wrong family members or family friends, "but Elena's been telling us for like 2 years that you were temporary while she figured out her career direction and what she actually wanted from life. She said you were a really nice guy and she cared about you, but not someone she saw herself with long-term." The casual cruelty of it made my chest tight with a mixture of pure rage and deep humiliation. 4 years of my life reduced to a placeholder relationship while she decided what she actually wanted from her future. 4 years of believing we were building toward marriage while she told her family I was essentially a practice boyfriend. "She said that recently?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from his uncomfortable expression and the way he kept avoiding direct eye contact while fidgeting with his champagne glass. "She's been saying it consistently for like 2 years, dude. We all thought it was weird because she obviously cares about you deeply, talks about you constantly and seems genuinely happy, but she keeps insisting to mom and dad that it's just temporary until she figures herself out. 2 years of telling her family I was temporary while building what I believed was a permanent future, 2 years of maintaining the elaborate fiction that she was still looking for the right person while sleeping in my bed every night and making plans for weekend trips we'd never actually take together. I finished my drink in one burning swallow, shook hands firmly with both her father and brother who seemed genuinely sorry for their family's dysfunction, and walked purposefully through the hotel's side exit into the underground parking garage, driving 2 hours through empty highways to the rustic fishing cabin I'd been slowly restoring as a weekend retreat, needing physical work and solitude to process the rage and humiliation coursing through my system like actual poison. I spent that entire sleepless night in my workshop behind the cabin, aggressively dismantling a Victorian dresser I'd planned to restore as a surprise gift for Elena, using the repetitive motion of removing original hardware and sanding away old finish to work through the devastating realization that everything I'd believed about our relationship for 4 years had been a carefully constructed lie designed to keep me emotionally and physically available while she explored more socially acceptable options. For 3 days after the gala, I received absolutely nothing from Elena, no texts, no calls, no desperate attempts to explain or apologize, until a lengthy email arrived in my inbox at 2:47 a.m. on Thursday morning with the subject line, "I owe you an explanation," and so much more. The message was a masterpiece of calculated vulnerability, explaining that she'd completely frozen under the intense family pressure and hadn't wanted to expose our relationship to her mother's impossibly high standards for son-in-law material until she was absolutely certain we could withstand the inevitable scrutiny and criticism. She revealed that her mother had married down from her wealthy Connecticut family 30 years ago, choosing Elena's father for love over a more advantageous match her parents had arranged, and had spent 3 decades subtly regretting that decision while pushing Elena toward what she called strategic relationships that would elevate rather than limit her social standing. The email contained screenshots of brutal text messages from her mother criticizing my blue-collar profession, despite my successful business and substantial client base, questioning whether Elena wanted that kind of life, with someone who worked with his hands instead of managing other people's money, and suggesting that Elena was settling for comfort instead of reaching for excellence, by staying with me long-term. I stared at messages dated from months earlier where her mother systematically dismantled my character and prospects. Furniture restoration is a hobby, not a career path for someone with your potential, and you're 28 years old, Elena. This is when you make the decisions that determine the rest of your life. Choose wisely. But the most damaging discovery came when I started investigating Elena's recent activities more closely, finding tagged photos on social media from events I'd never heard about, including several networking gatherings at her mother's exclusive country club where Elena had been strategically introduced to various, suitable, young professionals over the past 6 months. Her friend Jessica had accidentally confirmed this pattern 2 months ago with an Instagram story showing Elena at a wine-tasting event with the caption, "Elena meeting potential husband number 3 this week lol," followed by laughing emojis. A post that had been quickly deleted but not before I'd seen it and dismissed it as a joke rather than recognizing it as evidence of a systematic audition process. I realized with sickening clarity that Elena had been maintaining our relationship as her safety net while actively auditioning replacements, attending carefully orchestrated social events designed to introduce her to men her mother deemed more appropriate, all while sleeping in my bed and making plans for a future she'd never intended to honor. The revelation sent me into a fury that surprised me with its intensity, and I fired off a series of texts demanding immediate explanations that went unanswered for another full day, each message growing more angry and desperate as I processed the depth of her deception and the months of elaborate lies she'd constructed to hide her double life. When Elena finally appeared at my workshop uninvited on Friday evening, letting herself in through the side door with the key I'd never thought to ask for back, she was crying before she even spoke, but I found myself watching her tears with clinical detachment rather than the automatic compassion I'd always felt before. "Marcus, please just listen to me," she sobbed, her designer dress completely inappropriate for my dusty workshop filled with wood shavings and restoration projects. "I know how this looks, but you have to understand the impossible position my mother put me in. She's been manipulating me for years, making me feel like I had to choose between you and my family's approval." But standing there watching her perform grief and remorse, I suddenly saw her tears differently, not as genuine emotional breakdown, but as another calculated manipulation designed to restore her access to the security and stability I'd provided for 4 years while she'd shopped for upgrades. Her mascara was perfectly intact despite the supposed crying, her posture remained poised even in distress, and her words felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, as if she'd practiced this scene in her mirror before arriving. "You've been attending husband auditions for 6 months, I said flatly, watching her face change as she realized I'd uncovered the full scope of her deception. "Your friend Jessica's Instagram post about potential husband number 3, were you planning to tell me about that, or was I supposed to just keep being your backup plan until you found someone your mother approved of?" The way her expression shifted from performed vulnerability to genuine panic told me everything I needed to know about the sincerity of her tears and the authenticity of her supposed regret. 2 weeks after Elena's failed workshop visit, her younger sister Sophia reached out through Instagram direct message, requesting to meet at the sprawling botanical garden where I'd once built a custom cedar gazebo for their wedding venue showcase, a project that had earned me 3 major commercial contracts and Elena's genuine pride in my craftsmanship before everything went wrong between us. Sophia was everything Elena wasn't: direct, brutally honest, and clearly uncomfortable with the toxic family dynamics that had shaped her sister's approach to relationships and personal authenticity throughout her entire adult life. "I need to tell you something about our mother that Elena probably never will, something that explains everything that's happened between you two," she said as we walked past the gazebo I'd constructed 3 years earlier, its weathered cedar now beautifully integrated into the garden's natural landscape like it had always belonged there. "She's been sabotaging Elena's relationships systematically for years, but you're the first one she's actually seen as a genuine threat to her control." Sophia explained that their mother had developed an elaborate, almost scientific system for testing Elena's boyfriends over the past decade, introducing carefully selected, appropriate suitors at strategic family and social events and creating scenarios specifically designed to highlight what she perceived as inadequacies in Elena's current relationship choices, all while maintaining plausible deniability about her calculated interference. With your predecessor Jake, the high school teacher, she arranged for Elena to be seated next to a promising law student at 3 different family gatherings until Elena started questioning whether Jake's teaching career was ambitious enough for someone with her potential, Sophia continued, her voice heavy with years of watching this destructive pattern systematically destroy her sister's chances at genuine happiness. "But with you, everything escalated dramatically because Mom realized Elena might actually choose you over social status, and that possibility terrified her more than anything she'd ever faced as a mother. The revelation that I was Elena's first genuine love made the betrayal somehow worse and better simultaneously. Worse because it meant our connection had been authentic and she'd chosen to systematically destroy it anyway. Better because it explained why her mother's interference had become so aggressive and unrelenting in recent months." Sophia shared that their mother kept a detailed leather-bound journal where she'd written extensively about her own failed first love, a talented jazz musician named David she'd abandoned for a sensible marriage to their wealthy father, and she'd been unconsciously recreating that same painful pattern through Elena's relationships for over a decade. She writes about David constantly, pages and pages about how she chose financial security over genuine passion and has regretted that decision every single day since. But instead of learning from that devastating mistake, she's been forcing Elena to make the exact same choice, Sophia said, her anger at their mother's psychological manipulation evident in every carefully controlled word. But the conversation took a shocking turn when Sophia revealed the explosive family secret that explained everything about Elena's recent behavior and their mother's increasingly desperate interference in our relationship. Elena discovered 2 years ago that Mom had been conducting an affair with David that lasted 15 years after her marriage to Dad, Sophia whispered, glancing around nervously to make sure we weren't being overheard by other garden visitors or staff members. David died in a car accident when Elena was finishing college, but Mom kept everything: love letters, photographs, even hotel receipts from their secret meetings over the years. Elena found it all when she was helping clean out Mom's bedroom closet after Mom had minor surgery. The timeline aligned perfectly with when Elena's behavior toward me had shifted dramatically from openly loving to carefully distant. when she'd started introducing me as temporary and avoiding any public displays of our commitment that might reach her family's social circle. She realized that our father wasn't actually the safe choice Mom always claimed he was. He was the wealthy choice, the socially acceptable choice, but Mom spent 15 years secretly pining for her first love anyway, Sophia continued with obvious pain. It completely broke Elena's faith in love, made her think that maybe Mom was right about choosing practical partnerships over passionate ones, because even Mom couldn't make herself stop loving the wrong man despite having everything she thought she wanted. Understanding flooded through me like cold water as I realized Elena hadn't been protecting herself from her mother's disapproval. She'd been protecting herself from becoming her mother, trapped in a marriage of convenience while secretly longing for someone else, someone she'd convinced herself was wrong for her despite the overwhelming depth of her feelings. She's been fighting her own heart for 2 solid years, Sophia said with genuine sadness, trying to force herself to want what Mom thinks she should want, but she talks about you constantly at family dinners, defends you to Mom even when you're not there to hear it, and I've honestly never seen her as happy as she was during your first 2 years together before she learned the truth. The irony was absolutely devastating. Elena had been sabotaging our relationship to avoid repeating her mother's mistakes, not realizing she was recreating the exact same pattern of choosing security over love, just approaching it from the opposite direction. 3 days after my enlightening conversation with Sophia, I received an unexpected phone call from Elena's mother herself, requesting a private meeting at the Regent Hotel's elegant mahogany-paneled lounge, a carefully chosen neutral location where she could speak freely without family interference or the crushing weight of social expectations that usually governed her every interaction. I arrived expecting manipulation, threats, or another attempt to control the narrative around Elena's choices, but instead found a woman who looked genuinely exhausted and emotionally drained, her usual impeccable composure replaced by something that resembled actual vulnerability for the first time since I'd known her over 4 years. My smile at the gala wasn't what you probably thought it was, she began without preamble, ordering a double Scotch neat instead of her usual crisp white wine, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the glass. It was relief, profound relief that someone finally had the courage to break the toxic pattern I've been creating and perpetuating for years without fully understanding the damage I was causing. She confessed that she'd been attending intensive therapy sessions twice weekly for 6 months after Sophia had threatened to cut all contact with the family permanently, finally beginning to understand through professional guidance that she'd been systematically projecting her own deep regrets and paralyzing fears onto Elena's relationships while sabotaging her daughter's chances at genuine happiness and authentic love. I've been desperately trying to save Elena from making my mistakes, but I realize now with absolute clarity that I've been forcing her to make them instead, just from a different angle, she said, her voice cracking with what appeared to be genuine remorse and years of suppressed guilt. The conversation took an unexpected and somewhat shocking turn when she admitted with obvious embarrassment that she'd hired a professional private investigator to dig extensively into my personal and financial background 8 months earlier, hoping to find disqualifying information that would justify her interference and prove conclusively that her maternal instincts about my unsuitability for Elena were correct and protective rather than destructive. Instead, I discovered you're far more financially successful and professionally established than I ever knew or bothered to learn, with an impressive portfolio of commercial restoration projects, long-term contracts with major clients, and a business model that's actually quite sophisticated and profitable, she said, looking genuinely embarrassed by her unfounded assumptions and willful ignorance. You own your workshop building outright, you have exclusive contracts with 3 major boutique hotels in the city, and your annual income actually rivals that of most professionals I would have considered suitable for Elena. The revelation that she'd investigated me like a potential criminal was both deeply insulting and oddly validating. Insulting because it demonstrated the extraordinary depth of her mistrust and prejudice, validating because it proved I'd exceeded every practical and financial measure she claimed to care about for her daughter's future security. But the real emotional shock came when she explained with painful honesty what had actually triggered her mysterious smile at the charity gala, a moment that had haunted my thoughts for weeks and colored my understanding of that entire devastating evening. Watching you publicly claim Elena as yours and then immediately release her with such dignity reminded me powerfully of David, the jazz musician I should have married 30 years ago instead of choosing what seemed like the safer path," she said, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely for the first time. He had that same quiet inner strength, that same absolute refusal to beg for what should have been freely given, that same ability to walk away with his integrity intact. When I chose financial security over love, he wished me well and walked away with dignity, exactly like you did. She revealed that David had tried to contact her once after her marriage to Elena's father, writing a heartfelt letter she'd never answered because she was pregnant with Elena and absolutely committed to making her practical choice work despite her heart pulling her in the opposite direction every single day. I spent 15 years sneaking around behind my husband's back, meeting David in expensive hotels, lying constantly to your father, systematically destroying my integrity and self-respect piece by piece because I couldn't let go of what I'd voluntarily thrown away, she confessed with obvious shame and self-loathing. Elena discovered evidence of my affair when David died in that car accident, and it completely shattered her faith in love because she realized even the supposedly safe choice wasn't actually safe from devastating heartbreak and lifelong regret. The meeting concluded with her mother's sobering warning that Elena had been accepted to a prestigious fashion program at the European Institute of Design in Milan, something Elena had never mentioned to me despite it being a career opportunity she dreamed about for years, and her mother had actively encouraged her to go alone to avoid being held back by relationships that weren't ready for that level of geographical and professional commitment. "She'll likely return in a year expecting you to still be waiting patiently, just as I once expected David to wait for me while I figured out what I actually wanted from life," she said with bitter self-awareness earned through decades of regret. But some chances don't come twice in life, and some people are too intelligent and self-respecting to serve as backup plans forever. I learned that devastating lesson far too late, and I pray every day that Elena doesn't make the same irreversible mistake I did. 6 months later, my business had expanded significantly with 2 skilled apprentices and a contract to restore the historic lobby furniture for the city's oldest luxury hotel, when I encountered Elena at the annual Home Design Expo where I was showcasing my work alongside other local artisans and craftspeople. She was there consulting for sustainable furniture brands, wearing the kind of effortlessly chic outfit that had always made her stand out in any crowd, but there was something different about her presence. A rehearsed quality that I now recognized as performance rather than authenticity. She was accompanied by Dr. Andrew Harrison, the cardiac surgeon's son from the charity gala, and watching them interact felt like observing actors who'd memorized their lines but hadn't quite mastered the emotional subtext of their roles. Their conversation was polite, appropriate, and completely devoid of the spark that used to characterize Elena's natural interactions when she was genuinely engaged with someone rather than fulfilling expectations. I was explaining the restoration process of a 1920s Art Deco writing desk to potential clients when Elena approached my booth during a quiet moment, her smile bright but strained in a way that suggested she'd been building up courage for this conversation throughout the afternoon. "Marcus, your work looks incredible," she said, examining the before and after photos of my recent projects with what appeared to be genuine appreciation mixed with something that might have been regret. "I heard you expanded the business. That's wonderful." We made small talk about my recent projects and her consulting work, both of us carefully avoiding any reference to our shared history or the dramatic way our relationship had ended in front of her entire family at the charity gala. But when Andrew stepped away to take a business call, Elena's carefully maintained composure began to crack slightly, revealing glimpses of the woman I'd once known beneath the polished exterior she now presented to the world. "I turned down Milan," she said quietly, her eyes focused on a restored Victorian jewelry box rather than meeting my gaze directly. "I decided to stay and work on myself, figure out what I actually want instead of what I think I should want." The admission hung between us like a confession, and I realized she was waiting for me to ask the obvious follow-up question about whether her decision had anything to do with hoping we might reconnect and rebuild what we'd lost. Instead, I simply nodded and said, "That sounds like a healthy choice for you." Her face showed a flash of disappointment that she quickly tried to hide, but I'd learned to read her expressions too well over 4 years to miss the moment when she realized I wasn't going to make this easy for her or provide the opening she'd clearly been hoping for. "Sophia told me you two have become friends," she said, fishing for information about what I might know regarding her family's dysfunction and her mother's manipulative interference in our relationship. "She's a good person," I replied carefully. "Very honest about family dynamics." Elena's eyes widened slightly as she processed the implication that I knew far more about her family's secrets than she'd assumed, including the affair, the manipulation, and the systematic way her mother had sabotaged her relationships. "Marcus, if you know what Sophia told you, then you understand why you got engaged to Andrew after dating him for 4 months?" I interrupted gently, watching her face change as she realized I was fully informed about her recent choices and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The engagement ring on her finger suddenly seemed to weigh heavily as she glanced toward Andrew, who was still absorbed in his phone conversation across the expo hall. "How did your sister mentioned it when she called to invite me to the engagement party," I said, which wasn't entirely true but served to illustrate how completely I'd moved on from our relationship. "Congratulations. I hope you're happy." The lie came easily because it served both of us. It gave her permission to stop feeling guilty about her choices while making it clear that I wasn't available as her backup plan anymore. As Elena walked away from my booth with obvious reluctance, I noticed her mother standing across the expo hall near the sustainable textiles display, watching our entire interaction with that same knowing smile I remembered from the charity gala. But this time, the smile wasn't directed at me with relief or recognition. It was directed at Elena with what looked unmistakably like pity, as if she was watching her daughter become the next generation's cautionary tale. I realized in that moment that her mother's smile had never really been about me at all. It had been about a woman watching her daughter choose gilded comfort over authentic love, making the same mistake she'd made 30 years earlier, and knowing exactly how that story would end. Elena would have her respectable marriage, her social status, and her mother's approval, but she'd spend the rest of her life wondering what she'd given up to get them, just as her mother had done with David, just as the cycle would continue until someone finally had the courage to choose love over security.